Hi there. So this session we're going to talk about the emissions trading scheme, such as the one that's operating in the European system, as a mechanism for governments to reduce the amount of pollution. So what are some of the details? Well, we've got to set an aggregate quantity of allowable emissions, and we're going to call that Q hat, and that's got to be less than the current level of pollution. Quantity business as usual. So suppose we want to have a 20% reduction. We're going to require that businesses who pollute purchase or at least have access to a permit to pollute, and we'll call that Q subscript I. So that's the amount of pollution permits held by individual polluting businesses, I equals 1, 2 and so on. So what we're effectively doing is establishing a new property right to pollute. So remember, in the world where we're in now, you could tip pollution into the atmosphere for free. It was a common good. What we're doing with an emissions trading scheme is saying, you can't do that anymore. You've got to have a pollution permit. And further, we're restricting those permits to be less than the current amount of pollution. And this turns out to be a valuable property right. We then have to decide how we're going to allocate these initial property rights. We could give them to existing polluters. So we could just say, this has been your pollution the last 5 years, suppose it was 100 units, we're going to give you 80 permits to pollute, a 20% reduction. And that's what the Europeans did in the first tranche of their system. Or we could say, you put in a bid to obtain some of these permits, and we'll rank those bids from the highest to the lowest. It's a bit like an auction, and those who are willing to pay above the price will get them at the equilibrium price. And we also want to create a market for firms to buy and sell permits. Yes, you might think you need X permits for the next year, but it turns out that it's very hot weather or very cold weather, and you need to produce a lot more electricity, you need a lot more permits. Or it may turn out that it's really benign weather, and you need less permits than you purchased. So what a market does is allow for those changes to adjust through the system. And it's the market that will actually set the price, and we'll explain that in the following diagrams. So we're back to our old diagram of the aggregate amount of pollution. So again, on the horizontal axis is the increasing amounts of pollution, and on the vertical axis is the price per unit of pollution. And remember, we're starting at the initial system where pollution was a free good. We could dump as much as we liked, so our amount of pollution was here at quantity business as usual. What we've done with the tradable permit scheme is say, look, there's a limited amount of aggregate pollution, that's this Q hat. So it's saying we have to reduce the aggregate amount of pollution. That's the maximum quota. And individual firms, if they want to pollute, have to buy a permit. And we've got these limited permits. And so we're saying, how can we work out the allocation of those permits? Well, people who can reduce pollution at a relatively low price, these are the low-hanging fruit, will say, well, I'm not going to get a permit. They're too expensive. I'm going to reduce my pollution. I'm going to change my production method. I'm going to change the mix of products I purchase. I'm essentially going to sell permits. I don't need them. These guys up here, they've got expensive ways of polluting, or it costs them a lot of money to reduce their pollution. So they'll say, well, rather than reduce pollution, I'm going to purchase permits. I'm going to continue to pollute. And so we'll get a neat balance that'll set the market price at T. This will be the permit price. These people who can reduce pollution at low cost will sell their permits or don't need to buy them. These people who have expensive ways of reducing pollution will purchase permits and they'll actually be a little bit ahead. So what are some of the effects of the emissions trading pollution scheme? Well, first we get the reduction of pollution as is desired from quantity business as usual to the pollution quota restriction, Q hat. So that's the desired effect. Further, pollution is reduced at lowest cost if we have a comprehensive pollution list. And that's because people will buy and sell pollution permits. If you can reduce pollution cheaply, then you'll sell your permit. If it's very expensive for you to reduce your pollution, you'll buy a permit to pollute. And in a nice equilibrium, we'll end up with the cheapest options chosen and the more expensive ones we continue with. So the tradable permits, because there's a new valuable property right, have a scarcity value or price, which we call on the diagram T dash. Now we also can kind of guess that that permit price is going to be higher the larger the reduction in pollution, or the smaller the Q hat, the less comprehensive the base or the number of people who have to find permits to pollute, and the steeper or more difficult it is to reduce pollution as represented by the marginal abatement cost curve. Government, if it auctions it, gains revenue of Area A, what it sells the permits for. So a bit like taxes, government can be a net winner if it auctions the permits. Producers and consumers are worse off by Area A, that's really the revenue transfer to the government, but also they're choosing some more expensive ways of producing products or changing their mix of products that are less pollution intensive, so they lose a little bit more. But society gains from the reduction in aggregate level of pollution and less climate change down the track. So again, a bit like a tax, there's a net society win, but we can have some winners and losers within the story. So how do we think about individual products? So here, rather than the quantity of pollution, we've got desired things like electricity, transport. And also, we've got the nasty thing, pollution. So as we go along here, we get more and more electricity and transport, but we get more and more pollution. And on the vertical axis, we have the price per unit of product. In the equilibrium story, before we were worried about pollution, we operated where the supply curve just had marginal private costs, but no pollution costs with our demand curve. So this is our market equilibrium. That tells you that we will produce and consume quantity Q of transport electricity, and we'll have a similar amount of pollution, and it'll be selling at price P. Now we add in the emissions trading scheme, and it puts a price on pollution. And we're going to call that price on pollution C. And so the cost of the product is now going to include the marginal private costs plus this pollution cost. So the new supply curve has our marginal private costs plus the pollution cost. And in our new green world, we move here, this is our new world. Lo and behold, we have reduced the amount of electricity and transport. We've consumed less of these pollution-intensive products, but we've also reduced pollution. We also note that the price of the product goes up. So again, a bit like a tax. an emissions trading scheme puts a price on pollution and businesses then pass those costs on, so that ultimately it's you and I, rather than business, that pay these costs for reducing pollution. So why should we distinguish between a tax and a tradable permit scheme? Well, let's think about the world of perfect knowledge, where we know exactly where the marginal abatement cost curve is. What the tax does, it sets the pollution cost, the price, and then the market determines how much we reduce pollution. In economics jargon, we say a tax sets the price, the market sets the quantity. A tradable permit scheme goes the other way around. It sets the quantity, the reduction, the Q hat, and then the market determines the price, the T dash. And they have identical quantity, price and distribution effects. So if the permits are auctioned, we have no reason to distinguish between using a tax or a tradable permit scheme. In terms of reducing pollution, in terms of changing prices and our decisions, in terms of changing the composition of employment, but not much change in the aggregate level, they're pretty much the same. And so the question is, why would you worry about what do you choose? Well, unfortunately, the real world is we don't know exactly where that marginal abatement cost curve is, and it shifts over time. And when it shifts, we get a different story. The tax gives price stability. We know exactly what the price of carbon is. We know exactly how it runs through the system and affects the price of electricity and transport, but we don't know quite what will be the reduction in pollution. The tradable permit scheme, on the other hand, tells us exactly what will be the reduction in pollution, but the price can vary all over the place. And economists love to debate with each other the relative merits. But let me just illustrate that last point. So here we've got the story of our pollution. So we've got our aggregate amount of pollution on the horizontal axis as before. We've got the price of pollution on the vertical axis, beginning at 0 and working its way up. This diagram, we have a tax at level T, and on this diagram we have a tradable permit at quantity Q hat. And let's suppose we start with the initial MAC curve. Then the tax, T, is set by government, and the market tells us that the pollution will be quantity Q. If we have the same marginal abatement cost curve with the tradable permit, we set the quantity Q, and that gives us the price T. Now let's suppose that the economy grows much faster. This is China, growing very, very fast, and people want more electricity, they want more products. Then the marginal abatement cost curve is going to shift outwards. That is, if the price of pollution was 0, we'd want to do more pollution. And that's the same story for the tradable permit scheme. Well, what happens if we're in the tax world, this story? Well, we kept the tax at T, the MAC has shifted out, so our quantity of pollution has gone from Q to Q dash. We've got a change in the quantity, but the price is exactly the same. On the other hand, if we were in the tradable permit scheme, we've got the fixed quota, that's the maximum amount of pollution. As the MAC shifts out, the price of the permits go up. So the story then is, if the MAC shifts, and it could shift inwards, the European story really is the fact that their economies fell in such a hole, their MAC shifted not out, as China did, it shifted inwards. Quantity of pollution would have fallen, would have fallen very little. whereas in here what happened, the MAC fell, the price of the permits has fallen dramatically. So we have a choice between a tradable permit scheme with a known reduction in pollution but volatility of prices, or a tax with a known price and volatility of pollution reduction.